Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our World Whisky Tasting Part 1. Yes, Part 1, as we intend to do a Part 2, maybe even a Part 3 if you're lucky. But we'll see how we go as we get through this challenging period. I just want to introduce to you our esteemed co-hosts here. So we've got I don't know if you can see from left to right, but I've got left to right anyway. David Vital, who is the owner/stroke proprietor of Starwood in Australia. He's going to be presenting the Starwood range, well, two of the Starwood range. Then we have Shane Peary, who is the UK sales manager for Mackmyra, and he's going to be presenting obviously the Swedish whiskies from Mackmyra. And then finally, Craig Lee Watson, who is UK brand ambassador for Paul John or John Distillers, and he's going to be introducing Paul John whiskies. Sorry, I'm just letting a few more people in who are waiting. Okay, so right, so everyone hopefully should have their tasting packs, which we lovingly sent out over the last week or two. I hope you like them. I don't have one myself, but I've got the tasting cards, and most importantly, I've got the whiskey. We're going to start at the beginning with the Starwood Twofold, which David is going to tell you all about. I'm going to go silent whilst David tells us all about this whiskey. If you've got any questions throughout the tasting, you'll see a little chat thing at the bottom. Please feel free to send your messages to the chat, and I'll do my best to ask the questions to the presenters. If you're watching on Facebook Live, welcome. You can do the same thing. Write your questions in the Facebook post, in the messages, and we'll try and pick up on those and ask the questions. Some of them, if they're more general about world whiskies, we'll look at doing those at the end in the Q&A. But if you've got specific questions for each of the presenters, feel free to send them through. Anyway, so we'll start with David and the Starwood Twofold. David, please welcome and take it away.
Thanks, Eddie, and thanks everyone for joining. It's really exciting, to have so many people interested in the world whiskey category. I think we're seeing it around the world. I actually live in the United States, and certainly more and more shelves are having not just the whiskies that we've got available today, but a whole range of whiskies from around the world. And that's exciting because I think that it sort of talks to the curiosity and the interest that people have for trying whiskies done differently. Scotch whiskey and bourbon, particularly Irish, are all very entrenched in their ways. There's a lot of innovation happening in that field too, but I think it's fair to say that when it comes to the world category, that we're leading the way in innovation, and that's something that at Starwood we're really proud of. In the one-line statement for Starwood is really simple. It's Australian matured in Australian wine barrels. That's what we stand for. And I've told Eddie to cut me off if I kind of keep going for too long, but I can talk for days about those 5 words, right? So, just generally speaking, Australia's been making whiskey since the late 19th century. Most of it's single malt, in fact. And up until about the 1940s, the barrels that we used were probably ex-Scotch barrels, to be honest. They were kind of repurposed and sent overseas as whiskey at that point in time. And then when they were emptied, they were picked up by local distillers, and then the whiskey was matured in those particular barrels. The law in Australia is elegantly simple. We don't have these tomes of content that we need to kind of understand to make whiskey. It's relatively simple. It's basically a fermented grain mash that's distilled and spends a minimum of 2 years in wood. That's it. So, we can use any sort of grain. We can use any sort of fermentation technology and techniques. Distillation can vary from double pot stills through to column stills and anything in between. And wood, like it doesn't have to be a brand new American oak barrel as it does with bourbon. It doesn't have to be a particular style of oak. It can be any style of wood. With Starward, and particularly Twofold, we've taken a bet each way on each of these parts of the story. So it's quite an interesting whiskey. It's a double grain whiskey. So this is wheat and malted barley. I guess most like a blend if we're thinking of Scotch whiskey, but all from the one house. Blends are typically sourced from different distilleries and married together for consistency from batch to batch. But at Starward, it's all from the house of Starward. So we have 60% wheat grain spirit in there that's column distilled and separately matured, and then 40% single malt whiskey, which is effectively the next whiskey we're going to taste. And Twofold for us was really this idea that we wanted to be in everybody's sharing cabinet at home. An interesting whiskey alongside those great whiskies from around the world, be they from Ireland, Scotland, Kentucky, North America, Europe, that sort of stood for something that represented Australia. Because I think we can all agree that whiskies, when done well, represent their place they're made. They reflect the place they're made. And for us, wheat and malted barley are the two major grains that we produce. And wine barrels, I think we can all agree that Australians kind of known for making great Aussie reds. And so we figured that that was a great way of kind of anchoring the spirit to the spirit of Australia effectively. Let's talk about taste. So has everybody got their sample ready to go? When you nose Starward, the first thing that you kind of get is a fruitiness. That fruit component, particularly in Twofold, is coming from the barrel, right? These are wet-filled Australian wine barrels. So effectively, wine goes out, whiskey goes in. We're so close to wine growing regions that it enables us to kind of source these barrels very quickly and work with the winemakers to understand what's going to work for us. We have winemakers on our team that are picking barrels from wineries, but also picking barrels to make each of these expressions. And so that fruitiness is like berry fruit, particularly, but also, laddered and layered behind that is fruits coming from the spirit. During fermentation, we're going to get a lot of orchard characteristics, apples and pears, but also a hint of banana from fermentation. That's something that we're kind of really known for at Starward, particularly if any of you have tried the first whiskey that was available in the UK, Solera. That's kind of got a really banana bread characteristic to it. That's all coming from the fermentation and distillation process as opposed to the barrels themselves. So lots of berry characteristics on the nose, biscuity grain characteristics coming through, and baking spices. Those are the sort of like three areas that we're sourcing flavor from. One coming from fermentation, obviously, with those orchard and tropical notes. The barrels are providing the berry characteristics and that grain of that biscuity grain characteristics coming from particularly the wheat spirit in this whiskey. When we taste Nova, you'll see that there's a heap of complexity and intensity that comes from that whiskey. It's a bit of a stegosaurus back, if you know what I mean. Like it kind of continues right down to a really long tail. This is far smoother, right? Like this has got a roundness to it that the wheat component really fills in those gaps. And so from that perspective, it's probably more, I'm thinking of my dinosaurs, Brontosaurus, right? So it's just smoother, but still long and, has a great deal of length coming from it. These are young whiskies. So even though the legislation says a minimum of 2, they're between 3 and 4 Melbourne years. And what I mean by a Melbourne year is basically Melbourne has a very unique maturation climate. It's known for its huge diurnal ranges. It could be easily upwards of, if you watch the Australian Open, you'll know that, you know, we can have sweltering days upwards of 40 degrees Celsius, but then the roof in the tennis center will be closed because it's hailing rain. And that's a product of our geography. We're in the southeastern part of Australia. The predominant winds come from the west. That's how, you know, the roaring 40s were how we were discovered a few times. The westerly winds either come from the northwest and then impacted from the large desert that's inside the middle of Australia, or the southwest, which is another desert called Antarctica. So in that way, we have these huge shifts in wind that then have a profound impact on climate. You know, I'll leave Craig to talk about the climate of India, but you know, when you think of, say, for example, Kentucky, it can get quite hot, very, very hot. And Taiwan, the same sort of thing. But typically, it's either always hot in the case of some places, tropical places, or in the case of bourbon, it's seasonally hot. We have 4 seasons in a day, and it can quite literally range in temperature from that much. So for a 3 to 4 year old whiskey, it's got it's all natural color. So a lot of color, a lot of flavor coming from the oak, and a lot of complexity that belies the age of the whiskey. If we're talking about that traditional old world approach to whiskey production. You know, we're really proud of Twofold because obviously it's readily available. You know, Australia, as I said, been making whiskies from the late 1860s. We had a bit of an idle period between the mid 80s to the mid 90s, but that new wave of whiskey that, you know, perhaps some of you have heard of, like Lark whiskey or Sullivan's Cove, and there's some mainland whiskies like Lime Burners and Bakery Hill, all make outstanding spirit. It's just really, really hard to find. So for us, it was, you know, a real strong motivator to start the distillery, to have something that we could have in the sharing cabinet. And we think Twofold does a good job of that.
Cool. Oh, thanks for that, Dave. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Cool. Just a question from, well, all I can see here is Galaxy Tab A. I'm sure Galaxy Tab A has a real name, but
Eddie.
They haven't reviewed. Oh, is it Richard? The question is, how do you reach the 60% to 40% mix?
Yeah, so I'll let you in on a little secret. When we started, we really didn't know what the formulation would be. You know, we wanted a high malt content because we're just so, you know, it has a signature sort of style to it, and we'll get to Nova in a second. But we were sort of shooting for 50-50, maybe 60-40, could be perhaps 70-30, depending on how things were working out. And look, it's fair to say there's a team of 30 of us now at the distillery, and we never agree on anything, but we went through this process in a blind tasting fashion, just incrementally creating different expressions, and almost unanimously we settled on 60-40, which never happened. So we kind of figured that was a good omen for us to kind of come through. I love wheated whiskies, or blended whiskies. You know, one of my favorite American whiskies is Maker's Mark, which is a high wheat content bourbon, because of that roundness that it provides, and it just creates a silkiness in the palate as well. So it was always going to lean that way. But the 60-40 in the end was just basically a blind tasting, and you know, from within the team thinking about the sharing cabinet, how we could be distinctive. You know, I have you know, one of my other favorite whiskies is Lafroig 10. My middle daughter's name's Isla, so I've got to kind of I like those peated whiskies, but you know, for us, we could never out Lafroig in terms of that flavor intensity. But what we could aim for is the distinctiveness of flavor that you get from peated whiskies, and that's what we were shooting for. Was that, you know, when you put your nose to Starward, that once you've had it a few times, you can blindly pick up a glass and go, that's the Starward, because of the fruity characteristics. So you know, we wanted something that was well balanced and easy to drink, but also still had the complexity to make it distinctive for people to try and fall in love with.
Great. Great. Well, I mean, I've got a few questions for you, but I'll save them until a bit later because we're going to move on to our next presenter. But that was fantastic. Thank you, and a really good start to the tasting. I mean, I've tried Twofold many times, as I'm sure you can imagine, but I never get tired of good whiskey. But thanks for that, Dave.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're gonna move on to Craig now. Here, I'm just gonna unmute him, and Craig is going to take us through the next whiskey, which is the Paul John Brilliance, which again another whiskey I've had a lot of experience with, but never get tired of tasting. So Craig, please welcome Craig, and yeah, crack on.
Eddie, your bottles are bigger than ours.
Richard, get muted.
So thank you, Eddie. So I am Craig. I look after the UK market for Paul John. I'm sure there's a lot of you people out there that have been to a lot of Eddie's festivals, the amazing festivals to go to, and a lovely place to be. And if you have, you will have seen me there. I've been to quite a few of them, stood behind the Paul John stand. So as David introduced himself and the world whiskies, we're from a completely different climate. We are based in India, so we're based in the southwest coast of India, in a place called Goa. I have actually got a little slide I will share with you guys. I'll try to, as long as I can get the technology to work. So this is basically where we are. So we are based in Goa on the southwest coast of India. Our distillery is based there. We get a local water source from there. It's local spring water, beautiful, lovely, clean water. But the barley we get from the northern regions. We import it mainly from Rajasthan, but also from some parts around the foothills of the Himalayas. It's a completely different style of barley to what's used in the UK normally. So rather than being 2-row barley, this is a 6-row barley. It's a smaller grain, and I can show you with this next slide. But yes, so it's a little bit smaller grain than what would normally be on the 2-row. So but you end up with the 6 pieces. This gives you the barley grain. It's a lot more high protein, so it gives you a lot more viscosity in the drink. Also gives you quite a lot of fruitiness in that drink. So the drink, the question you have from us, the Brilliance, this is our unpeated version. When you taste this whiskey, you'll feel that lovely creamy, buttery oiliness in the whiskey itself. And it's got a beautiful fruitiness to it, which to me, it shows you our tropical background. As David was saying, we're a very hot, humid climate. We are roughly somewhere between 65 and 75% humidity most of the time, can go a little bit higher. Average temperature for us will probably be somewhere around 25 to 30 degrees centigrade on an average day. Can go as high as 40s. So hence we have a really fast maturation process for us. For every year we mature in Goa, it's probably the equivalent of 4 years extraction in somewhere like the UK. So we really get that really rich, vibrant flavors and color from our whiskies straight away. So Brilliance you've got at the moment, as I said, it's an unpeated one. This is a mixture of first and second fill ex-American oak. It is non-chill filtered, natural color. And I get a lovely sort of, that really rich, orangey, marmalade, tropical fruit notes on that. My next host, Shane, he's had a lot of things as long as with Eddie experience with this. We've gone through many bottles, sampling each other's stocks, and this is one of the ones that I always like to get people to try, especially on the blind tasting. Like Shane and David said, when we can do a blind tasting, a lot of people don't generally pick out that this is a whiskey from a different continent. Never mind that it's actually not Scotch whiskey. So I think for me personally, I've got a background with whiskey for a long time with my family coming from Scotland, even though I've been brought up in Yorkshire. I was very surprised the first time I tried this whiskey. I was expecting, not what I got. I was expecting something completely different. And I tried this whiskey and I was blown away by it. As I can show you about our water source, and this is something that I learned out very recently, because Goa is an Portuguese colony. I didn't realize that they actually used to export the water back to Portugal, which was quite a surprise to me when I realized that. So that shows you how fresh and clean the water was. So, and our stills, which were all produced in India. So we had Indian coppersmiths actually make our stills. We used the exact same rules and regulations as we do for Scotch whisky. So it has to be a minimum of 3 years. It's oak casks. We only use barley, yeast and water. Everything was handcrafted in India. There is, even though we are a relatively new distillery, we came online in 2007, 2008. Launched in the UK as the first ever expression, which was 2012, and I think Brilliance was launched around 2013, a year later. But even though we are that relatively new style of distillery, it's a very traditional distillery. Everything's done by hand. It's not computerized. It's a very craft-based distillery. So something that I really think, we have 3 warehouses on site at the moment, 2 different styles. We have a very similar to the American style racked warehouse, which is the colour photograph you can see. We have, I think it's 13 or 14 tiers in that warehouse. These are above ground, so they get very hot, very humid. And I do know that from tier 1 all the way to the top tier, in the middle of summer, there can be as much as 2 degrees centigrade difference. So you will see that difference in the top ones will be sort of more woody and sort of dark chocolate type notes come through on them, whereas the bottom tier will be a little bit softer, a little bit more fruitier. The black and white picture, that is for our underground warehouse. So we have a small selection of casks that are kept under the distillery. So it's none of the warehouses are temperature controlled, hence we lose on average around 8% a year to evaporation. So our angels in India, I believe, generally, I'm sure Dave will agree, generally need to join Alcoholics Anonymous. They do take too much for us. But that's just the thing. What's my next one? And this just tells you a little bit about the thing. So I'll actually stop sharing this now, so I can see you guys. But yeah, I think for us, for me, Eddie's been a great supporter of our brand for Whisky Lounge. I've seen a big difference over the past 2-3 years that I've been working with Paul John in that New World Whiskies, so McMara, Starwood, ourselves. I've seen a big influx of people coming on board, wanting to try something different. They're wanting a new experience. They want to, it's less about age statements, less about value and price, but about quality and experience. And I think we're seeing a big influx of New World whiskies from across the whole world, Europe, Asia, Australia, even Argentina, etc., that are showing that there's more to just the whiskey world than there is Irish and Scotch whiskey. And I have to say, people like Eddie at the Whisky Lounge and stuff, and people like when I work with jointly with Shane and stuff, we've really come across a lot of people that want to move away from just a traditional style of whiskey that maybe their fathers or grandfathers were brought up with. And I really have enjoyed this. It's been a big learning curve for me, seeing this big experience and big change in the whole industry. And I'm hoping you guys are enjoying this whiskey. The next whiskey we will try. Oh, Eddie?
Yeah, all good, all good. Thanks for that, Craig. That's a really fascinating insight. Just a quick question for you, yes, which I'd actually written down myself, but someone else, Dave, had also asked, which was, what's the current volume being produced at John Distiller? Well, at the site, at the single malt site of John Distillers.
So the single malt side, I believe on average we can produce around 1 million litres a year on the production side. That's not actually what we obviously get out into the market.
Yeah.
It's slightly less because obviously we're trying to build the stocks up for future demand. We're moving away from the ages. So the Brilliance you're trying now, generally 5 and 6 year old whiskies that are in this expression, and we're trying to sort of move to that a little bit older if possible.
Yeah.
But obviously, it's, as we said, we are a relatively new distillery, so it's more about building our stock levels and hopefully meeting demand.
We've got a message from someone called Shilton.
Yeah, so he's always a proper trouble causer. Stalker.
your favorite dancing stalker.
Yes.
Shilton's asking, Craig, what do you like best about Goa?
What do I like best about Goa? Me, so I went to Goa for the first time last year. I went to the distillery. It's a beautiful place. I'm torn between the whole vibe of the place, the culture, the food. But actually, I just got to relax and spend so much chilled out time with a great group of guys that I work with all year round at the international market. But I would probably go the food. The food just
food.
Yeah. I came back to the UK after spending 10 days in Goa. Decided to take the family out to the Indian we always go to. By the time I'd finished the meal, I was so disappointed. It just my favorite Indian restaurant just didn't meet standards anymore. No, so
Shilton seems to suggest that you really enjoyed the heat.
Oh, I love the heat. Yeah. Just remember, I'll be seeing Shilton later and telling him, "Oh, yeah, I'll be taking you to Scotland in the middle of December."
Yeah, exactly. Craig, that's brilliant. I'm sure there'll be other questions as we go on through, but that's.
No, I'm more than happy to answer as many as I can.
Yeah, and you know, Brilliance is it's a brilliant whiskey, and
yeah, we've spent many a dram supping this, Eddie, and been a great supporter of our brand.
Well, you know, I just like bloody good whiskey. I honestly don't care where it comes from. I'm interested where it comes from, but as long as it's good, you know, for me, that's my ethos. It's the company ethos. You know, you shouldn't be shackled or you know, restrained simply because of where the whiskey comes from. As long as it's good, we're good.
And as I was saying earlier, you know, the huge influx I've seen of people wanting to change and experience something new has been just real great support to the whole sector, not just our brand, but everything.
Listen, it's a pleasure. It's never a chore. Anyway, listen, Craig, thank you, mate.
You've got to move on to the next guy now.
Yeah, you've got a little bit of a long wait now because you're
Yes, I'm the last one. I can relax and just enjoy the drams.
Yeah, you can go and get a gin and tonic or something. So I'm gonna mute you now, Craig, and I'm gonna hand over to Shane.
Thank you, Eddie.
Cheers, mate. Shane, are you there?
I am, Eddie. Can you hear me?
All the way. Where are you actually, Shane?
I'm North London.
You're not. You're in Sweden.
Sorry. My Swedish South African accent.
You put the accent on a bit thicker. Shane, pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Eddie.
Thank you for coming on. Always excited to taste Mackmyra whiskies, as I am for the other two as well. And I'm going to shut up and let you talk about the Svenskek and all about Mackmyra and the very interesting story. So over to you, mate.
Thank you very much, Eddie. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. I'm going to do things a little bit different, guys, if you'll bear with me. I'm going to do death by presentation. Hope you can see this. And I thought I'd share with you some of the insights into Mackmyra, which is really worthwhile seeing. I don't know if you can hear it.
We can't see or hear it.
Really?
Yeah,
Okay.
you're not. There's nothing
Streaming.
being aired.
Okay, hold on. Thanks for letting me know. Okay, we'll try again.
Something's definitely happening. Yeah, if you now hit slideshow, you should be good to go.
Okay.
There we go.
Everyone see that?
Yeah, we can see that.
So, Eddie, tell me, is the music playing, or is there any talking happening? Or is it just a picture?
No music.
Okay.
No talking.
So ideally, this is just an overview of how it all started. And I thought it gives you some insight into Mackmyra as well at the same time. And I'll talk you through the history of it, but it gives you a nice overview of the distillery and inside the distillery and what goes on at the distillery and what we do at the distillery. And I thought it'd be really nice to show you. There is the new distillery that we built, the first of its kind in the world. It's a gravity-fed distillery. We have a visitor center there now. Those are the pot stills within the distillery on level 3 or 4. I can't remember which level it is. And a lot of firsts for Sweden. Mackmyra being the first whiskey distiller in Sweden. And how it all came about was 8 friends got together over a bottle of whiskey and discussed making a Swedish whiskey. And it kind of laid the foundations in 1998 for what soon was to become Mackmyra Swedish Whiskey in 1999. And they were granted a license, and they needed to build a distillery. And they didn't really know much about whiskey. So it was pretty much a learning curve for these guys, these 8 friends. And I'll show you pictures in a minute of the first old mill barn that they converted into a distillery, and how it grew to what it is now. Sorry guys, let me just get out of that. It's not working so well. So the initial distillery was this here, which is called Mackmyra Brook. Mackmyra is the village it is in, and the brook you'd think relates to the river, but it doesn't. So Mackmyra, direct translation, means midge or mosquito swamp. So they thought it would be a good name for the distillery and for Mackmyra. And brook means useful or everyday tool. And in the bigger scheme of things, it means industrial area. So this was the industrial area in this area of Mackmyra. And that is the old mill and power station that they converted into a distillery. I can't get this thing to go there. So they had a distillery. They needed to make a pot still. So they thought, well, we're going to try this. We're not very good at making whiskey. We don't know what we're doing as yet. So they handcrafted 100 liters of still. And this is very important. If you look it down in the right-hand corner, that 100 pot still is still standing in the new distillery today. When you cut 100 liters, you only get 30 liters out of it. And this is really important, guys, because we sell 30-liter casks to just about everybody in the world. And we sold over 22,000 casks to date to Joe Public, and that sort of was the foundation coming from the 100-liter still. And of course, as production grew, so did the pot stills grow, and we got to the point where we had full-size stills installed in that old distillery. We only use Swedish product, so you can see we have top right, we've got Swedish peat, and we use juniper in our peating process. We use obviously local barley, and we use Swedish oak, and we also use Swedish baking yeast. Now, there's a bit of a story around this. So when they run out of yeast at the distillery, they send Carl down on his bicycle to the shop, and he goes and buys it at the local store and brings it back, and they use that. And you actually saw it if you watch the video. They were throwing it into the production. So they only use local baking yeast. We don't cultivate it or make it. There's a logo that appears on top and bottom of every bottle, and always ask what it is. It's the tie that holds the strut in the building, keeps it upright. So they got the name from the village, and they got the logo off the side of the building, and you find that on the top and bottom of every bottle. So they had the whiskey. Well, they started making the whiskey. They had a distillery. Now they needed someone to put it. So they acquired an old iron ore mine called Bodis, and this mine is 50 meters below ground. It's about 35 kilometers north of Gävle, where the new distillery stands. And you actually drive into this mine. And the reason we took the mine was because the humidity and the temperature all year round is constant. So we don't lose a lot of alcohol when we store most of our product here. It's not something everybody sees. If you're a cast owner, you will get to see it. But otherwise, general public doesn't get to see this. So we store all our product in the Bodis mine. It was an iron ore mine used by Sandvik, and they used it to use their iron ore drilling machines to test them and to make sure they work properly underground. And then the government let it stand for a few years, and we acquired it. And we have bulk, most of our storage happens down here. And it's quite an impressive place. You drive into this and you just get this waft of alcohol as you drive in. And this whole underground mine fortress is a bit 007-ish, is filled with whiskey. So 30-litre barrels, 100-litre barrels, 200-litre barrels. That's our CFO walking around just showing parts of the distillery. Sorry, the mine, of all the places that it's stocked. And it's quite something to see. And if you turn the lights off there, you can't even see your hand. I mean, it's pitch black down there. It really is something. But there's no air conditioning, there's no heating. It's self-sustainable. The only thing we do is pump the water out of the mine, because that can be a problem. But other than that, that's where we store it. And we just have these rows and rows and rows of where we store all the whiskey, which is quite interesting. Sorry. We make two types of whiskey. We make elegant and smoky. We don't make peaty, although we potentially have been told that we could potentially make the most peatiest whiskey in the world, but we don't. We rather make smoky as opposed to peaty. And where elegant is non-peat. We have various ranges of whiskey. If anyone knows the Macmillan ranges, we have 17 different single malts. We have our core range, which is here in front of you, one of which we're going to taste tonight, made up of 4 bottles, Mac, Brook, Svensk Ek and Svensk Rook, which we're going to try later. And then we have a seasonal range, which we're going to taste in later part of the season. And we have a moment range, which is very, very good as well. So the limited range is the seasonal and the exclusive range is the moment, and I'm really exclusive. Getting to know your taste profile. So Swedish Oak, which is a Svensk Ek, which we're going to be tasting tonight. There's a little bit of a story around it. So Swedish Oak was foreign to Sweden. It was taken across 200 years ago, and it was planted south of Gävle, where our distillery is, which is about 150 kilometers north of Stockholm. And Swedish Oak came from France, and they planted it for the reason of building naval vessels to go to war with. So basically to build ships. And what they didn't take into account was 200 years ago was how slow the trees were going to grow, because of the climate, because the wood was foreign to the country. It took a lot of nurturing to get these trees to grow. And this is pretty much folklore, but this is what I hear. In the 70s, they received a telegram, the naval department, that their trees were ready to be cultivated to make ships, but the world had obviously moved on. So instead of being used to make ships, we now use it to make Swedish Oak casks. And yeah, it's synonymous with this one for tonight. It got 95 out of 100 out of Jim Murray's Bible. And I'm going to break away from here for a bit, guys, and go back to you guys, if I may. Stop sharing. So if you could pour some in your glass, here's a bottle of it. You can see what the bottle looks like. There's the logo top, and there's the logo bottom. And there's dimples on it all the way around. And there's a bit of folklore around that as well, but I'll tell you a bit later on about it. But pour it in your glass. So this is 7 to 8 year old whiskey. It's made from Swedish Oak. Everything we do, we put on the box. So if you look at the box, it says 10% Swedish Oak. You'll see that there's an oak layering on the box itself. It says Svensk Ek, which is Swedish Oak. So only 10% of Swedish Oak goes into the final product of this. Okay, so we don't hide anything. It's 46.1%. It's an unusual number, but it's kind of where we believe that our whiskies work best at. There is another reason, something to do with duty, but 46.1 it is. It retails in the early 50s mark. It is spicy, it's herby. It's got a nice aroma to it. It's nutty, it's a bit of citrus. You always get apple on it. And it's quite funny. Dave was talking about banana earlier. We do in some of our whiskies get a lot of banana on the nose. You don't get so much on this one. More toffee. Let's get it in. Let's try it. Bit of sandalwood, dried ginger, black pepper. A lot of spiciness. long aftertaste. And that is Svensk Ek. That is Swedish Oak.
Very nice, Shane. Very nice. I personally only have one question for you right now. Why is Jimi Hendrix missing from your 27 club?
How did you know? There's not many people that know that, but you're spot on. We just moved house, and it broke in the move. But you're well done, Eddie. Not many people know that.
I'm old enough and bad enough to know.
Yeah, you know, you're making me feel old.
Now, on to the serious questions.
Yes.
Or maybe not so serious questions. Another one from Shilton, troublemaker.
Oh, no, he is. He's licensed to cause trouble, that man.
He's in the garden dancing as we speak. He asks, and actually, very interesting, will we ever get 100% matured in Swedish oak cask Mackmyra? Is that something on the cards or not?
It's too pungent. It's too strong. We find that, you know, only using 10% adds that huge spiciness to it. And we have a cask called Gravity, obviously named after the distillery. And what we do is we take a bourbon cask, we cooper it down to 30 liters, and we put tops and bottoms on the Swedish oak. And it is unplayable. I actually have a bottle here of it. It's right from the cask, 47.9% ABV. It's called Gravity. And it's one of my absolute favorites. It's very well balanced. I think Swedish oak is just, it's too rough, too coarse, it's too bold. It just overpowers the whiskey if it's 100%. So the answer to that is no.
Yeah, but, I mean, I suppose in Scotch whiskey terms, it's like putting into brand new
it is
American oak cask.
It is. And you know, and the funny thing is, Eddie, with the Swedish oak is when they cut the trees down to use to make cask, they have to let it dry for 2 years before they can even start to use it. You know, it's really interesting, the wood. Yeah.
No, it's a really interesting story. I've got, again, like David and with Craig, I've got lots of other questions that I'd love to ask. So someone asks, what is the 27 Club? I should quickly just answer that. The famous musicians who died at the age of 27.
That's right. 100% correct. They never made the 28.
Robert Johnson, Janis Joplin, Kurt Cobain, what's her name? And Jim Morrison.
Amy Winehouse.
Amy Winehouse, yeah. So there you go. Yeah. Cool. Okay. Thank you very much, Shane. That was great. I'm going to mute you, and we're going to move back to Dave. Let me see if I can unmute you, Dave. The option to unmute you is, there we go. Dave, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yay. Welcome back. For those of you, Dave, obviously his distillery is in Melbourne, Australia, but I don't think that we explained that you're actually on the west coast of the United States at the minute.
Yeah, exactly. You might be thinking, wow, his lighting's amazing for such an early start to the day. No. I'm actually just a little north of Seattle. So, and unfortunately, I can't taste. Like, mind you, I've been doing a lot of tasting recently, so it's probably not a bad thing. But we don't have the pack in the United States. So
no, well, we looked at trying to get it over to you, but I think we would have just had some very happy federal authorities or something.
Pretty much, that's typical. And you know, I used to mule a lot of whiskey from Melbourne to the West Coast all the time, and like I'm running low on stocks. So, you know, first world problems during a pandemic, right? But
well,
nevertheless.
If we could get it to you, we would. And like I say, I'll save you a pack, and when hopefully when things calm down a little bit, we'll get that to you so you can enjoy it retrospectively. You'll just have to imagine from our own sort of ums and ahs.
And I'm familiar with all these whiskeys, so you know we've done the show route a fair few times. So
yeah, cool stuff. Okay, so you're gonna take us through the single malt expression Nova now, which obviously we're chomping at the bit to get into. So please take it away.
Yeah, look, Nova. I mean, they're both my children, right? So you don't have favorites with children, but depending on the day of the week, one's going to be more favored than the other. And I feel like it's the same with these two whiskeys. It really is about how you're feeling about the day of the week and which one kind of appeals to you. So as I mentioned earlier, all fully matured in red wine barrels, all natural color, all 100% single malt in this instance. This is the 40% component that goes into twofold of the malt whiskey. And the thing I love about this whiskey is that, you know, as we discussed beforehand, it has a depth and complexity that really shines a light on these Australian wine barrels that we were talking about beforehand. And let's go a bit deeper on wine, because I think that that's an interesting kind of area of discussion, given the panel today. Like, you know, we've talked about Swedish Oak, we've got American and Virgin Oak from Craig, but, you know, Australian wine barrels with Starwards is going to be a really different kind of impression. We source these barrels from iconic Australian producers like Penfolds, Wolf Blass, Wynns Coonawarra, Yalumba is another amazing partner of ours. And then in the northern regions of Victoria, we've got places like Tabilk, which very large family winery, but doesn't export all that much to Europe. And a whole heap of smaller producers that absolutely love us because we pay a premium for these barrels. You know, if they're not coming to us, they're going to be cut in half and sent to a garden nursery as a planter box for a lemon tree. So they're pretty rapt for us to come along and give these whiskies or the barrels another life. And importantly, you know, for them to kind of create a secondary income stream from the barrels as much as they do the whiskies, the wines themselves. So the common theme, and, you know, a common theme is that they're all red wine barrels. You know, Australia's kind of known for their big Aussie reds, kind of poke you in the eyes, give you a little slap along the face and sort of like say, hello, we're here. And it would have been really easy for us to create a whiskey in the Shiraz style of beverage, you know, big, bold, bombastic kind of flavors. And we were quite tempted by that, and some limited releases, you know, single barrels that we release do often have that sort of style. So they're, you know, a step up in terms of approachability. But what we wanted for the single malt was to have something, again, that could be accessible, that if this was your first New World whiskey that you tried, you know, from outside of Scotland or bourbon or Irish whiskey, that you'd be kind of going, oh, wow, I get a lot of cues coming in here from whiskeys that I'm familiar with, but it's definitely its own thing. So we wanted it to be something that could be the first rung in your world whiskey kind of repertoire and be welcomed with a big Aussie hug. But more so, there's an elegance to this whiskey that you wouldn't get if it was as bombastic as an Aussie Shiraz is to wine. And so again, on the nose, you're going to get all of that fruit characteristics coming through, like berry fruits, probably more dominant than the orchard and tropical fruits. And then, you know, there's this sort of vinous characteristic to it. Now, you don't need to like red wine to love Starward, right? Like, it's kind of, you know, the origin of it, but obviously after spending so many years with the whiskey and oxidizing and having exposure to that huge diurnal ranges, it does shift in flavor profile. The wine kind of changes. About 4 or 5 liters of wine in the barrel. And as I mentioned earlier, it's wine out, whiskey in. So, you know, you've got the ability then to have a lot of that character kind of develop over time. So on the palate, when you drink this whiskey, fruit, obviously, but that malt does a wonderful job of really kind of enveloping your whole mouth and creating a luscious mouthfeel. And in the middle of your palate, in the middle of your tongue, you're going to get a bit of grippiness. That grippiness is grape tannin, you know. So and how it kind of manifests is a length. Like, so there's going to be a length to this whiskey that belies the fact that it's a 3 or 4 year old whiskey, and it's coming from those wine barrels again. So we're kind of gifted in that way. Toasted oak, baking spices, and a little bit of pepper as well. You know, so these are the things that we think make an amazing sipping whiskey. And, you know, I'll quickly know if I'm cut off and shut down, but, you know, also makes amazing cocktails. You know, the go-to cocktail with Nova is a Manhattan. You know, if a whiskey matured in wine barrels can't pair well with cocktails made with vermouth, then we might as well close the shutters, right? Like, it's just kind of a match made in heaven, and has become a bit of an evening ritual for us at home, like to kind of finish the day with a Manhattan before we have dinner. And then, you know, during dinner, if I'm so, you know, so inclined, I'll probably make a highball, but rather than using soda with twofold, I'll use a tonic, a Mediterranean style tonic. So, you know, we're talking about whiskey not just from the place it's made in terms of ingredients and climate, but also from the place it's made in terms of culture. Melbourne's kind of known as one of the foodie capitals of the world. You know, the New York Times has only got one food bureau outside of New York, and it's not LA, it's not London, it's not Paris, it's Melbourne, Australia. And that's because, you know, we're kind of seen as a bit of an icon from the food scenes. MasterChef Australia is the most syndicated MasterChef franchise in the world because, you know, we kind of take our food seriously. And so it kind of made sense for us that culturally, if we're going to build an occasion around this whiskey, that it should be around food too. So, you know, we're pretty open about taking cocktails for a walk with the whiskeys, and hope you guys feel the same way.
Lovely, lovely. Yeah, I'm just ordering a Manhattan as we speak.
There you go. Good on you.
Yeah. Oh, I've got a part. Oh, excuse me a second. Sweet vermouth.
So the Vitali House spec is
go on.
Two parts Nova, one part Dolan vermouth. But any good quality vermouth will do the trick. Even actually any vermouth will do.
Yeah, I think we'll have to settle for any vermouth.
A bias towards Peychaud's bitters. Peychaud's.
Okay. We've got some decent orange bitters.
And not, well, orange is just a natural match as well.
Yeah. Well, we'll see what it's like in a minute. A very, very quick question for you, Dave, mate. So Lee, who's on the call with us here, he says he was lucky enough to visit Starwood whilst in Melbourne last year, and he's asking, has the ginger beer cask been continued, and if so, will it ever be available in the UK?
Yeah, one day it will, Lee. We just did ginger beer number 5. It just got launched. This whiskey is basically, it happened by accident. This is before mixers became premiumized and, you know, a big thing. I kind of said to the team, geez, I wish we could have the perfect ginger beer to marry with Starwood, because they were, you know, originally cloringly sweet or overly, you know, overly powered with ginger characteristic. And of course, you know, as I mentioned earlier, in the bond store and barrel houses, we have winemakers, but in the distillery, we have brewers, because that's the talent pool we have available. And so if you ask a brewer to make a ginger beer, well, of course, it's going to be alcoholic. And they needed a vessel to, the size they made was, the batch they made was too big for the fermentation vessels. That, you know, we were talking small batch, a keg, you know. So they put the surplus of the ginger beer in a barrel, like, and to ferment. And then at the end of that period of time, we had this amazingly spiked ginger beer with whiskey in it already at about 11% alcohol, and this amazingly seasoned Solera barrel, in fact, that was infused with ginger beer characteristics. So then we thought, well, what the heck? Let's put some Solera back in it and see what happens. And this whiskey now has cult following. We just released 1,400 bottles. It's in a ballot system. So, you know, we want to keep things fair and not go through the process of just the person with the deepest pocket winning the whiskey or buying the whiskey. So it's around about 100 quid a bottle, which, you know, for Aussie whiskey is pretty reasonable. Actually, it's probably about 13 quid at the moment, given the exchange rate, but that's another story. The idea being that we can get it around. last year's allocation, you know, you had more chance of getting into Oxford University than you did of getting one of these barrels. Like such was the demand for them. But we keep upping the quantities and we keep running out. But the aim is that we can make them seasonal, like quarterly releases of interesting barrels that we've matured or finished whiskey, finished starward in, that we can come to market with. And we definitely want to get some to the UK.
Sounds good to me, man. The more the merrier.
Yeah, and it makes a very decadent, delicious old-fashioned as well, as you can imagine.
Oh, that's at least in my top 3 drinks, old fashions. Dave, thanks, man. That was great.
Yes.
I mean, I've followed the Starwood story for the last few years, and it's just good to see the development, and you know, the whiskey's just getting better and better. You know, they started well enough, you know, but to see them develop and to see them so accessible, you know, from Twofold and over. Oh, hello. Here we go. As if by magic.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Shit.
I wish I had that kind of
Spilled up my
ability here.
But anyway, I'm going to move on now, David, if you don't mind, and we're going to go back to Shane for the where are we? I'm trying. Are you on, Shane? You've unmuted yourself. Well done. Thank you.
I am. I'm in the game. David, I was just sorry, Ed. I just want to say, David, that was really good. Thank you very much. Really good. I really enjoyed that. It's very much everyday drinking whiskey for me, I think.
Yeah. No, I mean, there's no bad whiskey tonight, and that was superb. Sorry, I had a bit of a spillage here.
Should I take over?
Hopefully we don't go offline. Yeah, Shane, you might have to take over.
Okay.
So Shane, you're gonna take us through a relatively new experience. So something was released really, literally on the cusp of this current dreadful scenario we're all going through.
Yeah, very much so, Eddie.
Something to celebrate, you know, as we're going through it, I suppose. But yeah, you go ahead, please go ahead and tell us all about the Grand Tay.
Grand Tay. So guys, here is the Grand Tay. So in 2009, we moved from the McMurray Brooks Distillery. We started construction of the new gravity-fed distillery, the first of its type in the world. And we started production in 2012, and the first bottle was released in 2015. It's an eco-friendly building, 45% less energy is used, and we use all the byproducts, or the, I forget what you call them, the offcuts, so to speak, to repower the electricity and run the distillery, so we actually don't lose anything coming out of the distillery. And every floor kind of has its, you know, fermentation and maceration and distillation process that goes through till it reaches the bottom. We do our own peating on site. As you can see, being a small distillery, we're very able to test things before we go into mass production. And you can see here malting and a smoker, which were hand built in the back of our CEO's garden. They actually had to move the smoker to a site off his premises because the neighbors were complaining about too much smoke happening when they were peating on site. We then moved to our next level. As you can see, we do our own malting on site. The malting goes in to the smoker, which is a 20-foot container with a mesh floor, where we get people to come in and spread it, and customers sometimes apply to come along and help out. And there's 2 customers actually spreading the the barley on the floor. And the top picture is the peat that is used to smoke the barley. But if you look in the top of the peat, there's juniper twigs. Now, we only use juniper twigs, not the berries, in our smoking process, and it adds a forestry, piney finish to it that nobody else in the world does, and it's all done on site, and you can go and see it. There is the distillery. I'm not sure if you can see this. I'll pull it across, but we also have a warehouse on the distillery. It's called the Forest Distillery, Forest Warehouse. And it's purpose built, and we store most of our 30 liters at the Forest Warehouse. And the reason is because it's convenient. It's located next to the distillery, and it just works for us. The temperature and humidity is slightly different to the mine, but the impact is not as severe as we thought it might be. But it just works, and that's where we store currently all the 30-liter barrels. We are going to be talking about our second range, the seasonal range. It's a limited range. What's nice about the seasonal is we only make between 6,000 and 8,000 bottles per year. And when it's finished, it's finished. We never, ever remake the seasonal again. They're almost one-offs. We may do a variant of it, and we do loads of different finishes, things like cloudberry, rum cast finish, just interesting mulled wine cast finish, and they all appear in this range of whiskies that we do. There's Angela. Angela is our master blender and chief nose officer. She's been with us since 2004, and in last year was inducted into the Whiskey Hall of Fame, only the second woman in history, and she is amazing. So we're going to be tasting tonight. It's called Grunter, which means green tea. How it all came about was Angela has a passion for travel and for food, and she was in Japan, and she was trying some teas, and she immediately thought, what can I do with this? So she came back to Sweden, and she met with a tea producing family, and the daughter of the tea producing family lives in Sweden. It's a lady called Yoko Ono, and there she is. And they worked together on the project, and they selected 4 different types of teas. And what they did was they took them, they macerate them with neutral new make spirit for 4 months in a barrel. Then they added 7-year-old whiskey, and they left it for 6 months, and they were really happy with the outcome of it. And they thought, wow, we're onto something here. So they said, all right, we've got to try this on a bigger scale. Now I'm going to read to you the 4 different teas. They are quite complicated. There they are. The Yame Sencha, which is a rich, soft green tea. Yame Yokoro, which is an elegant and sophisticated tea. Karibo Hochi, which is a nutty, round, and delicate tea. And Yame Mache Shinobi, which is a rich green tea. So they took these 4 green teas and they said, right, we're happy with these. What we're going to do is now we'll take it to the next level, and we're going to saturate much bigger barrels. So again, the maceration process, she took each of the individual teas, she put them into the barrels, but this time she put them into Oloroso barrels and used Oloroso to bring down the alcohol in them and macerate these teas. She left it there for 2 months. She took it out. She put the 7-year-old whiskey into the barrels and left it there for 19 months. She then took a full autumn of mixing and matching the barrels till finally she had the final recipe and developed what we know as green tea. The final mix, we believe, is 25 to 30% of each of the different teas, but it is exceptional. There are some of the pictures of the valleys where the teas came from. There's the initial project that we used, which she started to do to try the different teas. There's Angela with the green teas. In our first competition in the Craft Spirits Awards in America, we won a gold, which is quite something. And there it is there, guys. So that is the story of green tea. And I'm going to go back to you guys. And I'd like you to pour some in your glass, guys. This is an interesting product. So I told you about the bottle and the dimples on the bottle. The dimples were, I believe, the 8 founding members actually all put their thumbprint on the bottle when they were first made. And that has stayed with us throughout the range of Mackmyra. This green tea bottle, you can see, it's got the green tea logo on it, which is quite something. Oh yes, and the corks are all reused cast barrels that we use to make as corks. The packaging is slightly bigger and different. Nice collagen packaging, nice and easy. Let's try the whiskey. On the nose, you should get a nutty, honey, salty, spicy, almost oak roasted tea. Yeah, let's try it. Being a 10-year-old whiskey, you get that oiliness, the smoothness, the mouth is just full of herby and tannins. It's just luscious. It's the first of its kind in the world, people. This is quite something. Because it's a seasonal, we change spring and autumn and winter and summer. And when it runs out, it's run out. We've got a bigger run on this one. We did about 8,000 bottles initially, but I believe we're down to about 2,000 bottles worldwide. So if you want some, now's the time to get it.
Wholesale.
Wholesale. That's my job. So yeah, first of its kind in the world. It's different, Eddie.
It certainly is, and I mean, I find it really fascinating. It's very delicate and very complex and packed full of very different flavors. And for me, as you know, it's like with Starwood in terms of the wine casks is very much part of its DNA. With Macmira, there's obviously a very innovative and local produce, but in this instance, you're actually taking stuff from the Far East and bringing it in and making really interesting whiskey with the resultant maturation. So yeah, no, I really enjoy that.
Yeah, it's different. That's the problem with Angela. She brings out these, seasonals, and you fall in love with it, and then come winter, she brings out a new one, and you fall in love with that.
That's the beauty of whiskey, particularly, isn't it?
It is a bit,
Even the standard whiskies will change ever so slightly. I say standard, there's no such thing as a standard whiskey, but they will change over time. Amanda wants me to just say that the Macmira Skog, I don't know if you remember that, Shane. It's one of the Moment series.
I do remember it. Yes, it was before my time, but I've tried it.
Yeah. Well, Amanda famously cannot stand smoky or peated whiskies. That's the first smoked whiskey that she actually really enjoyed, and she wanted to make that public.
Thank you, Amanda.
It wasn't public enough already.
So we only make 2 peated in our entire range, but occasionally we'll make a Moment where we do a little bit of peat with it, and we released one recently called Lava, which was probably the best whiskey I've ever tasted from Macmira. It was exquisite. Yeah.
Great stuff. Oh, that's thank you very much, Shane. That was lovely. Dave, I just feel sorry that you can't get to taste this.
Yes, sorry, Dave.
But we will keep you some of this. I've still got some in the bottle. Hopefully you don't want me to get stuck into that. Okay, so poor Craig here has been waiting for donkey's years.
Keep the best for last, Eddie.
keep the most pungent for last, and I don't mean you, Craig. Obviously, I mean. So Shane, thank you, mate. We'll come back to you in the Q&A, but thank you for that one. Okay, Craig, you should be back on with us.
I am, Eddie. Thank you.
Are you hanging in there?
I'm doing well. I've been joining the drams. There've been some amazing drams there.
Yeah. How's the sweat box?
It's cooling off. The sun's gone down. It's actually starting to cool off a bit now. I'm just quick nip up and open all the windows. Good lad.
Okay, so we're gonna finish off the tasting side of things anyway with the Paul John Bold. Hopefully that's what you've got there. There we go for you guys on Instagram. Now, obviously, this is the only whiskey we're tasting this evening, which is officially peated, which obviously we would keep to the end because had we tasted this early on, it wouldn't have done our palates any favors. So you crack on, Craig, and I'll mute myself and let you get on with it.
Thank you, Eddie. Thank you for this thing. So yes, so last whiskey of the night, and we've had some amazing drams tonight. You know, I really loved everything that we've had tried from Starwood and McMira. But our last dram tonight is the Paul John Bold. So it's the third of our what we call flagship expressions. So the first one was Brilliance. We have one that's in the middle of these two, which is called Edited, which is a lightly peated expression. And then we've got the Bold. So Bold is fully peated. This uses one style of peat. So our distillery, we don't have peat in India. So we import the peat from Scotland. We import it from Islay and the Highlands. And the Bold expression only uses the peat we use from Islay. We had three options when it came down to making a peated whiskey. We could do the option that we do, where we import the peat and then we malt our barley in India, which means we stay with that 100% Indian ingredients. We could import the malted barley from the UK, but then we can't say we're using 100% Indian ingredients. Then we could also possibly use barrels that have previously held a peated whiskey, but then it's more of a finish rather than being a true peated whiskey. This is peated to about 35 parts per million, which sounds quite a lot, but one of the things that with our maturation process in India, in Goa, you've got to realize that this is like a 5-6-year-old whiskey, but with the maturation, we're looking at that sort of 18-20-year-old range in extraction. So the peat levels, even though it smells on the nose, you know, you get that lovely Islay hit, that TCP iodine note, that sort of salty bacon, you know, such a beautiful nose, and it smells, should I say, like it's going to be quite intense. But then when you actually get around to tasting it, it's actually a lot softer, like the older style Islay whiskies that you can get, like that sort of 18-20-year-old Ardbeg Laphroaig, where the peat levels died back and it's allowed that wonderful cask influence and the Paul John DNA to come through, that sort of rich tropical fruit note. So you get a lot of fruitiness. I get that rich island note, that rich TCP, everything else, but underneath that I get that really rich tropical fruit, sort of marmalade, you know, pears, stuff. Such a beautiful one. So we only do about 25% of our production a year is peated whiskies. It's split between the Islay and the Highland peat. Bold, like I said, only uses the Islay one. Edited uses a mixture of both styles, and then we have some select casks. This again uses both styles, but at a bit of a higher level, so probably around that 40 parts per million, and is bottled at a bit of a higher ABV. The Bold is 46%. First and second fill American oak, I believe. We are on that now. It used to be just first fill, but I believe we're actually getting into that first and second fill stage. But please try this, guys, and hopefully this is one of those whiskies, especially for those people that maybe don't like peated whiskies. They'll actually see that actually they're not all big in your face, grab all your taste buds and swing you around the room, but there's actually some quite delicate peated whiskies out there. So on the palate, it really makes me salivate, really get a nice little saltiness, that peaty hit, and then I get that sweet fruitiness from that I would say is Paul John. It's a really soft and fruity peated whiskey, in my opinion, even though, you know, I get a lot of people that turn around and tell me it's quite big and in your face. I think when you compare this to some of the peated whiskies out there, it's very gentle, very soft, and very easy drinking. As Eddie will tell you in a little while, our favourite stoker, Shilton, this is his favourite expression. And I have been told, Eddie, to just say, I drink whiskey and know things. So I'm not quite sure the meaning of this, but I'm sure you do know. But yeah, no, this to me is, I've always been a big peated whiskey fan, but I've always been more of the sort of the big peated bombs, the Ardbegs, the Laphroaigs. And I got introduced to the Bold when I started working with Paul John, and it actually opened my eyes up to a a different style of peated whiskey, something where you could go for something a little bit softer, a little bit more gentle, something that you can drink all year round. Because I do find that a lot of the big peat bombs, you kind of more the winter period. During the summertime, it's not something you really want to drink those big peat bombs in. As Dave was saying earlier on, though, we do use this in our cocktails. We do the old fashioned. We also do a couple of little dessert type cocktails, which if you do a quick rummage around the internet, you'll see them. One of them's done using some cream and honey and caramel and stuff, which I tried making once. I didn't get to try it because the wife and the daughter nicked it off me, which is saying something considering they don't like peated whiskies at all. But all I can say to you guys, realistically, is thanks a lot for this. It's been a great pleasure for me doing this with you a lot. We have expanded our range. I'm afraid it happened just as the pandemic started, so I didn't have the opportunity to do much with this or actually get anything, so I could have used some of these. So I've actually only got a couple of bottles, and one of our new ones, which I'm sure at some point Eddie would love to try, would be this new PX Select Cask. No, not the PX one, Eddie. Or maybe you would prefer the Oloroso. The Oloroso. You've got good choice. I would generally be a PX person myself, but actually I think this time round the Oloroso wins hands down. It's just a lot more richer one. And we have done the Christmas edition, which was Oloroso with a hint of peat, and that was a stunning dram to have if you really like that sherry and peat.
Thanks, Craig. That was superb. And I mean, I have to say, I've long been a fan of the peated Paul John whiskies. I mean, I love the unpeated stuff, but there's something special about the peated stuff, which I from the very start of always. I mean, I love Islay whiskies, and I've never been I've never shied away from saying that. And I've tried a lot of really good stuff over the years. Very fortunate to have done so, and a lot of older stuff as well. And I always found, particularly with the single cask peated stuff from Paul John, this kind of minty eucalyptusy note, which you only get from mature, and when I say mature, I'm talking about sort of 20-plus-year-old Islay whiskies, which is cheating, frankly.
Yeah. We get to do that in 6-7 years.
Yeah, it's just not fair.
No.
to others. I mean, I'm fine with it. I get to drink it, but it's just very unique. I mean, in terms of the peated output, though, I've met Michael once or twice, Michael de Souza, who's the distiller. I'm fairly sure that it's him that was the driver behind the peated style. He loves peated whiskies, and hence, similarly to Masataka in Japan, wanted to, bring that traditional style of Scottish whiskey to Japan, but obviously Michael for India.
Yeah, so obviously we launched the Brilliance stuff, but then when we decided we wanted to launch that peated whiskey, we wanted something that was kind of, as the name suggests, bold, and something that would grab people's attention. And I think Michael hit the bullseye with this whiskey. It is a beautiful whiskey, and like you said, there's just something about the Paul John peated whiskies, because they're not massive peat bombs, but they've got so much depth, so much quality, and there's just, you can lose a night just sat there supping them with a few friends. It's so easy to do. And the single casks, like you mentioned, the single cask peated editions are amazing. You have to keep your eyes peeled, because hopefully the next single cask we do for the UK will be a peated one.
Yeah.
Just nudge our guys in the right direction. We've had a lot of demand for it.
Do you know what? I would love to taste like a sort of medium peated Paul John, just where the peat is balancing out the sweetness of something like the Brilliance, you know, just to take the edge off. And yeah, because I love medium peated whiskies at the minute, and I'd love to see how that would come together with Paul John, because I think, you know, you guys could do that, you know.
Yeah, I think his mind's so active and so constantly on the ball of looking at what we can and can't do and what he wants to do. And to be honest, I'm just really looking forward to what he's fetching out in the future. I know a few bits that are coming out, and I think they're going to surprise people with what they are and how they taste. There's some really good stuff to keep your eyes peeled for in the future.
Yeah, no, that's all good news. More good whiskey coming your way.
Definitely, more good whiskey coming our way. I'll get as much of it across as I possibly can.
Absolutely. Well, listen, thanks very much, Craig. That was really, really good, and obviously the whiskey speaks for itself as well. So we're gonna do a brief Q&A with all of the guys here before we wrap up. So I'm just gonna unmute Dave and Shane. Dave's refusing to be unmuted.
Yeah, I saw that.
So just one or two questions. Okay, so Craig, you talked about phenol parts per million, which is obviously a bit of a, yeah, obviously all of us know what that means, and we're you know, well versed enough. But can you just tell us what does that mean? What is phenol parts per million, and what does that mean to the finished product?
The higher the number, it would generally mean the more smoky, peaty sort of that impact will be. But as I was saying with the Paul John one, I think it also depends on that distillery style as well, because I'm sure you've tried some of the Octomores, which are in the hundreds, and you would expect that would be like eating a piece of peat or drinking some coal dust or something, and they've actually been quite fruity. So, but it would generally mean the amount of peat that's actually imparted itself to the barley when you're malting it.
Yes.
That generally comes down as you do the distillation.
Yeah.
The 35 parts per million for us is actually what it is when it goes into the barrel.
Oh, so that's the ppm in the spirit.
Yes.
Wow. Okay. So the barley itself must be quite high up there.
It's around that 40, 45, I believe, and then it's come down, I believe, from what I was hearing from Michael the other day.
Yeah. I mean, the peating, just for those uninitiated, peating is essentially a very old-fashioned way of treating barley, of drying barley. You know, back in the day when peat was the main fuel source in the Scottish in Scotland, it would be what would be used to dry the barley. Phenols in the peat smoke would be absorbed by the damp barley, and the resultant flavor through fermentation and distillation would be this kind of smokiness that we associate with Islay whiskies like Lefroy and Ardbeg and Lagavulin and so on. So this is what we're talking about in terms of the Paul John, the bold. So we get that smoky flavor because that barley has been treated in that way. Thanks for that, Craig. That's really good. David, well, just in
the runner.
Sorry, I
David's done a run.
Like at the last minute, just right now. So,
David, I just well, it's one big question, really. I mean, I before I got into whiskey, I was into wine, beer, and a little bit into whiskey. This is going back some years, obviously, and one of my favorite things to begin with, as I'm sure a lot of people, it's like a gateway drug, Aussie Shiraz, Aussie red wines, and I was interested to hear you mentioning some of the very famous winemakers that you do work with. But I was just wondering, is there a preference for you in terms of the grape variety, or is that kind of going too deep? Or
so It is a little deep, right? In that actually what is more important, we're going to geek out now on wood policy for winemaking, is the fact that, you know, a winemaker making a Shiraz from the same varietal of grapes, from the same paddock of grapes, could have profoundly different wood policies in terms of what they're looking from the barrel, in terms of the wine that they want to finish up on. So what we'll find is that most of our barrel suppliers are looking for higher oak content in their wines, either because they've got an Asian audience who are kind of Chinese audience that really love that oak characteristic, or these wines are made for cellaring for long periods of time. So think of, you know, particularly the Penfolds portfolio can kind of put a, you know, couple of years on them, you know, tens of years sometimes. So that then is going to be way more influential in terms of what flavor profiles we're going to get out, as opposed to just a Shiraz or a Cabernet or a Pinot. Having said that, most winemakers that are thinking about cellaring are thinking about bigger Aussie reds, right? That's kind of the wheelhouse we work in. We've got some white wines in the Bond store that are amazing. You know, oaked Chardonnays were a thing of the past. They're coming back. I get excited by that. Typically what happens is that they waterfall through the winery. So they will have started as a white wine barrel and then moved to a red wine barrel for just resting wine in for a period of time. So those resting barrels aren't much use for us. I mean, they're great because they infuse the barrel with wine characteristics, but the oak functionality of the oak's kind of missing, you know, that toastiness and the baking spices that we get from American and French oak barrels. So on one hand, yes, but not for the reason you think. And that was what I was saying earlier, that, like, you know, you can have $100 wine that's actually come from a barrel of, you know, that's been aged in a barrel, that actually to us isn't going to make a great whiskey.
Yeah. And I mean, there are other distillers around the world that use red wine casks from all kinds of places around the world. I mean, you know, France and Italy and so on. But being that you are so local within, you know, you have such a sort of advantage in terms of where you are in being able to harvest these casks. How do the producers, the wine producers, feel about it in terms of, you know, mentioning them in your sleeve notes or whatever it may be?
Yeah, so they love it. They love it. It's been great to kind of work with them because, as I mentioned, we're giving a second life to these amazing wine barrels that otherwise would be just a lemon planter. But also, you know, we're looking at partnerships, so we could do wouldn't it be great to do a mixed dozen of, you know, Penfolds Grange with the barrels that Starwood used to mature the whiskey that had Grange in it, or taking for a walk a Pinot, a Chardonnay, a Shiraz, and a Cabernet for one producer, and then having the complementary barrels from those particular producers to really reinforce the provenance and flavors of both the wine and the whiskey. So they're really excited. We have a mission to put whiskey on the dinner table. I said that earlier. And one of the things I said also was this idea of wine out, whiskey in. What they don't know is that we're just about to launch a marketing campaign in America, which is like, not only do we mean that about our process, but we also mean it about the table. Take wine off the table and put whiskey on it. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, have some of that. Yeah, that's very interesting, because I know that some distillers have run into issues in terms of being able to name the wine producer that has used the barrel previously, whereas I think you might be in a fairly exalted position where you may actually be able to show that off, and the wine producer is actually happy with that.
Yeah, it's an earned trust though too, Eddie. Like, it wasn't early on, you know what I mean? Because it's a byproduct early on. But, you know, as we've sort of, you know, taken the whiskies to all of the award shows and pick up best in classes and gold medals and things like that, and, you know, deliver on the promise of what we kind of said we were going to do with the whiskey, there's a confidence that kind of builds up now. And, you know, more often than not now, we're saying no to wineries as opposed to us clamoring for wine barrels. Whereas in the early days, it was, you know, difficult to get people on board with this.
Yeah, no, for sure. Well, you're doing a great job. You know that.
It's always nice to be affirmed, though, because you never take it for granted.
What's this? We had gin tonight with our dinner. So what? Oh, never mind. Anyway, thank you.
No.
What
he said is totally correct.
Yes. So why not have spirits on the dinner table? That's what Amanda's point.
Yeah, absolutely.
We had gin rather than wine with our fish and chips this evening.
I don't know if you could. We had gin-based cocktails with our fish and chips rather than wine.
Why not?
For the first time in a long, ever, I think.
The bold goes amazingly well with seafood, though, Eddie.
The what?
The bold goes amazingly well with seafood.
Yeah, well, we'll be seeing that tomorrow night. Don't you worry about that.
If you love oysters, just a couple of drops on an oyster. It's amazing.
Absolutely. Okay, I just wanted a quick question for Shane, if I may, which was a question of mine actually, which is, can you hear me, Shane? You're okay?
Yeah.
Now, obviously, you moved from the old distillery to the new distillery some years ago, and you'd already created a footprint, you know, flavor footprint for Macmira.
Yeah.
And then suddenly you're shifting quite early doors to a new facility, which is completely different, you know, completely different equipment. Were you guys not, you know, shitting yourselves about, you know, are we going to get, you know, how could you possibly guarantee you were going to get exactly the same or even close to the original spirit character of the first distillery?
It's quite interesting you should ask that question. So it's only 12 kilometers as the crow flies from the old distillery to the new distillery. And they had the same conundrum. So what they did was they built a pipe system from the Macmira Brook distillery to get the water, the exact same water that was flowing through that distillery, piped to the new distillery. And because it's mostly downhill, they didn't even have to pump it. It just kind of flowed. And they use exact same water at the new distillery. So the consistency is almost guaranteed, so they thought. And yeah, I think, you know, Eddie, as well is having stockpiled so much over the years, they were able to change it and mix and match the recipe a little bit to adjust it to what it needed to be. And you must remember the whiskey was getting older, because when we first produced it, it was only 3, 4, 5-year-old. Now we're at 16, 17-year-olds, so the whiskey's got better. So yeah, there hasn't been too much of an adjustment, thank goodness.
But has there been a slight change in characteristic between the two distilleries? And the sidebar to that question was, what's happening at the old distillery? Is there still any production there, or is it just completely kind of mothballed?
Interesting story, actually. You know, Macmira is full of stories. So there is, you know, our early stuff. The earliest stuff we released called Brilliance. It was really early, and it was really rough, for want of a better word. We've kind of refined it over the last few years, so we got better at making whiskey as the years went on, and I think the move had something to do with that. So they're possibly right there. So we mothballed the old distillery in 2012, and we moved the whole production across. And we had a young guy who worked at the old distillery, and he went off to uni, and he came back to work for us. And they said to him, "What would you like to do?" And he said he'd like to make gin. So they handed him the keys, and he went back and opened the old distillery. So we make gin out of the old distillery now. We make 2 organic gins, which are exquisite, actually.
So is all of the gin made at the old distillery, or is there gin made at the new distillery as well?
No, whiskey at the new and gin at the old.
Okay.
Yeah.
Actually, I think I was drinking Negronis with the old distillery gin last night. So
Thank you.
it's good gin at least.
It is good gin.
So thanks for that. Okay, I'm just going to have a quick wee look. Actually, there was one other question for you, Shane. How do you balance maturing in a mine with its super consistent environment with trying to get woody notes from the various cask types?
Yeah, that's a good question for Angela. Look, you know, yeah, I'm in sales. You got the wrong person. But I think, you know, we've been doing it for 21 years now, so we've kind of got the handle on how it all works down there. And you know, I think having the 30-liter barrels helps us with blending and so to speak mixing of liquid. It just speeds up the process, and we get a finer product out of it. But we use so many barrels. I mean, you're talking about cloudberry, lingonberry, birch sap wine, Calvados cask, port cask, green tea cask. You know, we have so many different casks because our range is it's changing all the time. And once we made it, we move on. We don't do it again. So I think once we get it right, we make the product and we move on. You know, we don't store any of it. We don't keep it for any length of time. Yeah.
Well, you're all doing sterling jobs in terms of helping to spread the word of world whiskey and getting it out there. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Eddie. Yeah.
Okay, so I think I can't see any further questions. I'm just going to ask our camera person if there are any. No, we're all good from from an Instagram point of view, apparently. I suppose all it remains for me to do is to thank you. I'm going to unmute everyone, but I would like everyone to behave themselves, particularly Richard Turner, and just say a big thank you to all of our guests for giving us their time and for being great co-hosts. So I'm going to unmute you all, so you can all say thank you. No, I slipped.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Much appreciated.
Cheers. Most welcome.
Great to join everyone.
Thank you. Brilliant evening. Cheers.
That's enough.
Thank you guys for
great. Thank you. Cheers, everybody. Thank you very much.
So, just very quickly, thank you very much again to David, to Shane, and to Craig. It's been a fascinating tasting.